When the Canon R6 Mark II came out, videographers everywhere rejoiced. Clearly, they intended this model to be more video focused by adding a bunch of extra features for it. For example, no 30-minute recording limit, better temperature control so there wasn't that much overheating. They actually have overlays for vertical conversion and other widescreen formats that people use for video. And of course, they added false color. These are all meant to improve the quality of our lives as videographers using Canon cameras. But the one feature I haven't given enough attention to is the false color. So in this video, I'm going to cover false color and decide whether it's a gimmick or actually something useful for us videographers. So let's start off by defining what is false color. False color is a tool that we use to judge exposure. The way it works is that it actually maps certain colors to certain light values on your scene. This is usually a feature on external monitors that you can get and is very useful for video exposure because it allows you to actually judge every part of the image individually and see where there's pockets of darkness, maybe pockets of brightness, and see whether or not skin tones are properly exposed as well. It is much better than trying to judge exposure using the histogram on these photo cameras because the histogram doesn't tell you what part of the image is bright. It only tells you overall how many of those pixels in the image are bright or dark. And at first, when you're going to use false color, it's going to be very confusing and honestly kind of strange looking because the colors they choose are very peculiar. I've seen it, I think it's like red, purple, green, yellow, and then some grays to hold the values in between. And so it takes some getting used to, but once you get used to it, it's actually very valuable. First, we have to set up the false color on this camera. So make sure you're in video mode and then go into the menu setting. In the red menu, you just got to go a few pages and you'll see the option for false color. If this is grayed out, simply select it and you should see some sort of dialog box that will tell you that some setting is on that you need to turn off for it to be enabled. If you can select it, you can just go ahead and open it and you'll see you have two options: false color enabled and the false color index. From here, you can just simply turn it on. And when you exit out of the menu screen, you should see false color on your LCD. A quick pro tip here is I actually like to assign false color to a button on the camera so I don't have to constantly go into the menu system to access it on and off. So to do that, you can go to the Customize Dials menu, which I believe is the orange menu on this Canon camera. And I like to assign it to something that I don't press too often. In my case, it's this little button on the back right of the camera. I know some people use that for back button focusing, but I don't use it at all. So that's where my false color lives. And I simply just hit that button whenever I want to enable it and hit it back again to disable it so I can just look at the image in a more normal way. All right, so now let's actually go over how to read the false color on this camera. So anytime you're going to use false color, it should come with some sort of index that will tell you what color is assigned to what brightness value. On the Canon R6 Mark II, you can only access this through the menu system by going to that same spot where we found false color and then going down and selecting the index. So for the R6 Mark II, purple and blue means the image is dark. Then you have green, which is like a go sign, if you will, and that is actually to judge 18% gray. That's for if you have some sort of 18% gray card, or if you use some sort of color checker, there's usually an 18% gray strip that you can use. That should be green, and that's how you know you're properly exposing for middle gray. Then you have pink, which is actually one stop over 18% gray. And this is usually where I actually like to have my skin tones on. So on the bright side of someone's face, I try to make sure that the false color index reads pink on that side of the person's face. Then we have the very high end, which is yellow, which is right above white clipping. And then you have red, which means your white is clipping and you're losing detail in that area of your image. So you're going to want to commit to memory this index so that you can actually properly expose without having to constantly go back into the menu system. Now let's talk how do we use false color to expose. As I previously hinted in, basically, ideally you would have some sort of gray card, right? You can use a gray card and just make sure that when you hit the false color on, you see green on your gray card. Fantastic. Then you should be properly exposed for that subject and that lighting with that gray card. However, I end up actually exposing more often for people because that is my main subject when I'm using this camera. And so I tend to focus on where the pink is actually facing on the person. I adjust settings on the camera or maybe even the ND filter such that when I look at a subject's face, the pink is on that person's face and I know I'm properly exposed. I also do like to check where it's clipping both in the shadows and in the highlights. So if I see red, I try to make sure there's not much of it, unless of course it is a very bright light source. So things like the sun or sometimes lights in the scene, there'll be a little red patch on the screen. And if it's on a light source, I accept that as fine. But if it's on something else, I will try to adjust exposure such that I can get rid of it because I do like preserving detail in my highlights. Same goes for the blacks. I just keep an eye out for any purple spots. Purple spots just means that the blacks are clipping, so I prefer to have some detail in the shadows. So I'll adjust exposure, or maybe I can adjust my lighting so I can get rid of those purple spots. And sometimes those purple patches are just natural parts, corners of the room, dark areas, shadowy parts that aren't well lit. And if that's your intended look, then that's perfectly fine. It's just something to be aware of and something I actually enjoy using when I use index colors or false colors, is seeing those two endpoints, the red and the purple. So based off of this short overview, does this seem like something you'd like to use? Let me know in the comment section below. But for now, I'm going to give you my judgment on false color using this camera. The first issue I have with it is that there's not enough colors in the index. They give us essentially, I think it's 5, but you can't really tell the in-between values. So you kind of just see, if you're adjusting exposure, that these colors sort of wave over the image. And if you want to get something between that green and pink, you can't really tell. It's just going to be gray. All the in-between values on this false color index is just gray. And so having any nuance in the image is really hard. And essentially you're just looking for green and pink and then are trying to avoid red and purple, which is fine. It works for judging overall exposure, but I would just prefer a much more fine-tuned index where I can see more gradients and actually make a better judgment call on the exposure of the image than the one I currently have with the Canon, which just feels a little more blocky. The other issue I have with it is that it won't show on an external monitor. Oftentimes I am using an external monitor for client projects. However, false color does not go out to an HDMI output. Instead, it only goes on the LCD screen and the viewfinder. And oftentimes when I'm using the monitor, I make sure the LCD is off. So it ends up being kind of a useless feature if you're going to use an external monitor. But then again, you probably should be using the external monitors because I do think it's probably going to be better than the Canon R6 Mark II's false color. Lastly, the index is only accessible in the menu system, which I find kind of frustrating and confusing, especially if you're just getting into false color, because I'd rather have the index where I'm going to be judging exposure, which is in the back LCD screen. Because when I was first using this and preparing for this video, I remember I found it very confusing. Like, oh wait, which color was this one referring to? And so I'd have to go back into the menu system, go to the false color page, select the index, be like, oh, okay, that's what that color meant. Oh, green was for gray and pink was for faces, or whatever it was that I was trying to expose for. And if you want to open up the menu, you have to stop recording. So essentially, once you start recording, you do not have access to the index. And so you better commit it to memory, or you can do what I did, which is take a picture. And honestly, it's only 5 colors to remember. So you'll get the hang of it pretty quickly. It's just, as a beginner, it's kind of annoying, and I wish they just put the index on the LCD screen and maybe toggle it as a feature you can turn on and off so you can quickly access it without having to go through this whole menu system. So what is my final verdict? So I know I talked a lot of crap pretty much the last minute or two about what I think is the problem with the false color, but I will say, for a beginner videographer, for someone who isn't necessarily trying to get all those nuances when they're using false color in terms of judging exposure, it does a fantastic job actually. The way I personally like to use it is to just make sure things aren't clipping in the shadows and things aren't clipping in the highlights, which is that red and purple. Easy to see. With a click of a button, I can be like, oh, this is clipping, this is not clipping, etc. Fantastic for that. When it comes to judging the middle exposures, which is that green color and that pink, I just try to keep things in the pink, but once again, it's not the most accurate and not the most wide range of colors. And so I just kind of got used to it and just live with it. On the last few projects I've used it in, it's helped me keep consistent exposure when I switch from 24 frames to 60 frames per second. And even when I switched from certain lenses, so I used the 28-70 f2, which allows a lot of light in. But then I switched to some 1.2 lenses, like the 85mm, and trying to match exposures from that while adjusting a variable ND can be tricky. But with the false color, it was pretty straightforward because I would just make sure that the same colors were appearing on the same parts of my image, whether it be the subject or the background. And the image kept relatively even exposure despite all those changes I was making. So all in all, is the Canon R6 Mark II's false color a gimmick or something actually worth using? Honestly, I would just say it's worth using, but I wouldn't say it's the most robust exposure tool you have at your disposal. Prior to using the false color, I used zebras a lot more, and essentially that's what I used to use it for, was to judge skin tones, which was 55%, and then I judged clipping, which was 95%. And I can basically do the same thing with false color while getting a much more wider range over other parts of my image, because the zebras will only show up on those parts of the image that I assign the zebras to. So having that wider view is nice and is pretty straightforward, but nothing that I would go home bragging about. Is that the expression? It's nothing I would brag to someone else about. I would actually much rather use an external monitor's false color for a much more accurate and a much more detailed report of exposure. If you'd like to learn how to use zebras on this camera, which is how I started judging exposure and still works to this day for me, you can check out this video here. I want to thank you all to making it this far in the video. If you have, you're one of the select few that actually likes hanging out with me. So I like you. Let me know what you guys want to see next. If you have any questions about cameras, exposure, or in video in general, I'd love to answer them and make future content about it. So thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.